you're atoning yourself now.
Adorning myself, perhaps, yeah.
By investing in the nature economy and
I
agri-tech.
think my soul can't be redeemed. I can never
But you're
undo.
eating insects. You're doing something.
Nothing that I can do in my lifetime will undo my carbon footprint, having worked 10 years in the oil, or 12 years in the oil industry and 11 years in the construction industry. But I'm hoping maybe I can kickstart a trend that then can continue and deliver much more impact than positive impact than the negative impact I have participated in.
Hi everyone and welcome to Conversations with Loulou. My guest is Hossam Allam. He is the co-founder and managing partner at Climate Resilience Fund, investing in agriculture technology startups and the nature economy. He is an angel investor. He co-founded Cairo Angels back in 2010. He sits on the boards of 9 different startups, 2 NGOs, and his family business. We're going to be talking about regenerative farming, insect protein, and the role that startups play in helping us achieve our sustainability goals. Thank you for coming, Hossam.
Thanks for having me.
Flew all the way from Saudi. You were at Leap.
Yes.
And before that in Cairo.
No, before that in Jeddah.
In Jeddah.
Visiting Kaust.
Okay.
Which I recommend for anybody.
You live in Cairo though,
yes,
right?
Yes, I do.
All right, okay. Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I want us to try to demystify some of these big concepts, sustainability, food security, regenerative farming. So it's going to be educational.
I'll do my best.
Yeah? Okay, well, I came across in my research something that I found really interesting, and I thought we can open on that. So 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption is wasted globally. This is by the World Food Programme. And all food produced but never eaten would be sufficient to feed 2 billion people. I mean, that's insane. There's another statistic, and I'm going to let you speak, but if wasted food were a country, it would be the 3rd largest producer of carbon dioxide in the world after the US and China. So clearly we have a very, very big issue. What are your thoughts on that?
So the 3rd statistic is a global statistic. The number is higher in this region.
Okay.
And the consumption, the equivalent of number of mouths fed would also be higher in this region because we eat less per capita than other countries do. So of course that's a tragic statistic. It's absolutely correct. And if you think about also all that food that was wasted, there was fertilizer used to farm it, there was water used to farm it, pesticides used, soil was consumed to farm it. There is biodiversity and land that was reclaimed, that was reclaimed and destroyed from being wilderness to turn into farmland, so that we could farm it, grow it, bring it to plate, and throw it in the trash. So it's a serious problem. It's one of the biggest, it's one of the lowest hanging fruit in humanity right now to consume all the food. And please, to your listeners, think about what you order in restaurants. Think about what you buy in supermarkets. Order and cook what you're going to eat. Don't throw food away.
So, I mean, this is. Do we know how much food we import here as a region versus how much we produce?
Yes. So, Africa and the Middle East are the biggest food importers globally in quantum, in the amount that they consume, and also as a percentage of total food consumed. And in the GCC, that number is, if I'm not mistaken, pushing 90%. For the rest of Africa, it's sort of hovering around the 50 to 60%. That's the largest globally. And Africa, of course, is the largest population density, or not population density, but largest number of people, and it's the largest land mass as well. By arable land, Africa should easily be able to feed itself, but it doesn't for reasons we can get onto in the next half hour. But yes, GCC in particular is very exposed to food import risk, which is climate risk as well.
Okay, so this takes us into this notion of food security. It's something that we keep hearing about in the GCC. So can you define it for us or just explain what it means in layman's terms?
I mean, it's sort of what it says on the tin, right? If you don't produce your own food, you're at risk unless you can buy it and import it. The GCC in large part is wealthy, and it has the capital available to import food at good prices, and so command market share in terms of purchasing. If for any reason that flow of import were to be disrupted, then you simply can't feed the population. Now, what would disrupt food import?
Shipping.
Shipping, which
Shipping
was
costs.
disrupted, right?
Yes, COVID.
Political unrest, as we saw also in the GCC not so long ago. But I also think climate change, which is actually one of the central thesis of the company that I run, that once the countries that we import from, and for my country, Egypt, we're talking about Bangladesh, India, Ukraine, Russia, Brazil, Argentina, and there are similar countries that export to this region. Once they face their climate moment and can no longer produce as much as they used to produce because it's too hot or too salty, ecological conditions change and suddenly crops simply aren't viable any longer, exporters will have to decide who they will export to and who they simply just, who's going to get dropped off the dispatch sheet. And there, I think countries like mine are extremely vulnerable because it's, poorer,
They don't have the buying power.
and we don't have the buying power, don't have the political power. And so climate risk is food risk.
But you have the land, like Egypt has a lot of land and it's fertile land as well, right? Or is it just near the Nile, that delta?
So Egypt's arable land currently is concentrated around the Nile Delta and the Nile, but we're losing it at a pretty fast pace because
To construction?
Definitely,
Okay.
urban development is a huge reclaimer of land globally, and Egypt as well, but we're also losing it to sea level rise. I mean, a big part of the Nile Delta is becoming too salty to grow what we used to grow and what we need to grow on it, but also desertification. And again, we can get in the next half hour about how desertification does not mean that land is lost for good. It just means that the water cycle has stopped in that area. You can jumpstart a water cycle. That's a kind of scientific discussion that we can also have. But an area like here, farming in the GCC is sort of like farming in the Arctic Circle. The conditions just don't lend to it. And if the Arctic Circle had a large population or a medium-sized population wealthy, they would find a way to farm. And the GCC is also investing in finding ways to farm and meet their own food needs as far as possible. And it's indoor farming, it's vertical farming, it's introducing new food groups that maybe not historically have been part of the human food chain or animal feed chain. But there's excellent research being done and excellent attempts being made both here and in Saudi Arabia to address that issue.
I saw as well that in places like Africa, for example, I think there was in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a page that you referred me to called the Catalyst Fund, and they said that 50% of fruits and vegetables produced never make it to market consumption.
Yes.
So why do we have all that waste at the point of farming basically?
That's a two-part answer. The first part is that it either never grew properly on the branch, and if it did, a lot of it is lost in the farm. Like it isn't harvested on time, it isn't grown under optimal conditions, so it drops off the branch and rots on the ground.
So like more water, less water, the fertilizers being used?
Correct, exactly.
Okay.
Maybe the pH, the acidity of the ground isn't spot on. Yeah. The amount of humidity or water, moisture that's given is either too much or too little. You don't hit that sweet spot. Western and Eastern farming practices are very, very precise, and they know how to get exactly the optimal size of tomato or strawberry or potato, and they know exactly when to harvest it, and everything is very fine automated. That doesn't happen in Africa, and why is the second part of the answer. But there's a lot of wastage there, and then once it's harvested, it stays too long before it's then taken to market, and when it's taken to market, it happens in an unsophisticated, unrefrigerated supply chain.
On the back of a truck, basically. Crates on the back of a truck.
In many countries across Africa, mine being no exception, you see tomatoes and beets and tomatoes just strewn on the side of the road because they fell off the truck, right?
Yeah.
That is all part of that third of wastage that you're describing. And again, I go back and say, all of that used water and soil and pesticide and fertilizer to be grown. So it's all, we're consuming, just never actually using it. Now, why is this part of the world, and Africa in particular, more prone to those sorts of losses? That is a historical and often legal issue, and that is that land has been so fragmented due to land ownership laws and land ownership practices that now most farms are tiny farms, right? And so they're owned by, these what's called smallholder farmers. In Egypt, 80% of our food production is farmed on less than 10 acres. Africa-wide, 70% of farms are less than 10 hectares, are less than 2 hectares, which is ballpark 10 acres. So these are very small farms, and on small farms, you cannot extract the economies of scale to invest in technology and automation and sensors to really get that precise farming that Western and Northern farms, global North farms use. So it becomes unsophisticated farming, low quality seeds that don't compete very well against weeds and so on. And the losses start incurring. And the more losses there are, the poorer the farmers get, the less able they are to invest in technology.
So talk to us about like some of the solutions, because I read about regenerative farming, and there's also sustainable farming, and I think they're different. So talk to us about some of these solutions, basically, and have they reached Africa?
Yes, they have. So let's define, right? So let me give you my definitions, because there's probably several definitions, and I don't want far more experienced, agronomists who are going to listen to the show to come in and sort of say, that's completely wrong, Hossam, you don't know what you're talking about. Regenerative is something completely different. And I do want to stress that there's nothing I can say on the show that is my knowledge or something that I have discovered. I am completely recycling and regurgitating things that I have learned by reading. None of these are good ideas of mine, right? But sustainable farming is about farming in a way that uses resources efficiently, whether it's energy, water, or using fewer pesticides, less fertilizer. And if you're going to use fertilizer, maybe organic fertilizer is better than inorganic. Just using less, that's about sustainability. But regenerative farming is kind of using nature more to your benefit rather than fighting nature. So our ancestors, they farmed in regenerative ways. Regenerative farming is the farming that we used to use to feed ourselves before we discovered synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides. African farmers, the Incas, of Latin America, all across the world, there are examples of how farmers have used insects and mold and cycled crops and not tilled, that is to turn the soil, not done it too much, so that nature could keep supporting the food production. Once synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides became part of farming, we sort of dispensed with all of that, because I can now just fertilize the hell out of my land, and it just keeps giving me and keeps giving me. I don't have to be sophisticated in terms of how nature behaves. Unfortunately, what's happening is that because we've not given land the opportunity to behave the way it should naturally, it is slowly losing its nutrient value. And in the span of 200 years, the carbon content, the goodness content of soil has been largely depleted, and it's broadly anticipated that in the next generation, huge swathes of agricultural land globally, including in mass production geographies, will just start to fail. It will not be able to deliver anymore. And one of the ways to do this, you can look this up online, is that there are champions of what I'm talking about here that do cross-sections of soil, and they say, look how deep the root structure in regenerative farms goes. It goes down a meter, sometimes 1.5 meters, because there's so much goodness for the roots to get out of the soil, versus mass farming, where there's pesticides and fertilizers used, where it just goes down a handspan, because all the goodness is being applied artificially. So regenerative farming is sort of, it's a new way of thinking about farming based on ancient ways of farming, but it's what can regenerate soil and allow it to sustain itself for many generations to come, as opposed to mass farming now, which is on the edge of mass failure.
It feels as if also regenerative farming is more about the entire ecosystem as well, right? So it's not just the soil; it's also the diversity of plant life and animal life, right? In that ecosystem, how much water it consumes, how much water the soil retains. So I feel it's like more holistic.
Holistic is the operative word. That's absolutely correct. Yeah. And soil relies on bugs and worms and mushroom root systems and plant root systems and microbes. It relies on all of those things to sit there, and it relies on also to capture water. So as rainwater, runs across land, it's captured in all of these systems and it's retained in the soil, and then it can transpire into the atmosphere and create rain. The moment you start using synthetic means of farming, all of those systems die, and eventually the soil cannot retain water anymore, so it dries and becomes desert.
So even if you keep stuffing them with pesticides and these vitamins, fertilizers, so we're still headed in the wrong direction. It doesn't matter. It's not something technology can rectify, basically.
No, I mean, look, nature knows how to do this, right? And in startup world, we're always talking about track record, right? Nature has 500 million years of track record. It knows how to do this. We just have to let nature do its thing on farmland.
You mentioned something interesting, which is mass farming. There's a huge pushback on the meat industry, right? They say that like cows produce all these methane gases. They're one of the biggest polluters globally. And meat consumption is going up. So from the statistics that I saw online, I think per capita and in the Western world or in the industrialized world, people consume on average 70 kilos of meat per year, whereas in developing countries it's around 28 kilos. I think is the war on meat basically justifiable, considering that also on the other hand you have things like mass farming, for example, for our fruits and vegetables that are pretty bad for the soil and the ecosystem, as you just highlighted. I know it's a big question, but
it's a big question, and honestly, I'm not terribly qualified to answer it. But let me say this: the way that we are mass farming, mass producing, and mass consuming at the moment is pretty unsustainable, because
we're talking now fruits and vegetables. We're talking things for human consumption. Right?
I understand.
Yeah.
Humanity has probably outgrown its natural size, right? I mean, all species have a natural equilibrium size, and then nature sort of contains it a little bit. You never see an explosion of elephants or wolves or viruses, well, sometimes, or oak trees. You don't see an explosion because nature has a way of containing the species and keeping them in balance. We are the exception. We have outgrown our natural equilibrium point, and we continue to consume. So our mass consumptions of certain food groups is probably unsustainable in the sense that we should be, we probably think of ourselves as having varied diets, but we should probably have even more diversified, varied diets. And we've all sort of somehow learned that what's available to eat is rice and bread and potatoes, and that's what's available, right? But actually there are a lot of food groups all around the world that belong in the food chain. The consumption of meats is unsustainably high. It's not just about the methane release from cattle farming, as well as sheep and chicken and so on. It's also the water consumption and the land consumption, because I mean, huge swathes of wilderness are being reclaimed to farm cattle so that we can have salami on our pizza. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't eat meat. I actually believe that we should eat everything we want, but that there are sustainable thresholds for what we should eat. Now, I am unable to tell you what the sustainable thresholds are, and I'm looking for someone to tell me, how much egg should I be eating every week? How much meat should I be eating? So that for 8 billion people, we can hold this story together. But there is a sustainable amount, and I think it's incumbent on us to just reduce a little bit what we know to be very sort of high planet footprint food groups, including meats.
Are we all gonna eat insects in the next 10 years?
I hope so.
Yeah, you hope so.
Well, I mean, 2 billion people globally knowingly eat insects now,
yes.
Right? And I would argue that there are billions more, you and I included, that are eating insects now unknowingly, because the ingredients or the materials within insect exoskeletons is currently being used in everything from health supplements to medical pills to weight loss medication and so on. I mean, that it's already in there. they just, of course, don't say this came from a fly. It's called something else, right? It's called chitin or chitosan, you know, and you think, oh, what an interesting scientific word. That's basically fly body, right?
Okay.
In your pill, right? You just, that's not how it's marketed, but you're consuming this stuff already.
Okay.
In the same way that you're also consuming algae, microalgae, and you're consuming all sorts of weird and wonderful things, just not knowingly.
Okay, I think algae people can maybe live with, but I think insects, it becomes borderline. I did some research as well. I saw there's quite a few big startups now in Europe farming insects and using them to produce bars and oat bars, fruit bars, or sorry, insect bars.
Yes.
So how, I mean, what does that mean? Is this being used now mostly for animal feed, or do you see it, you know, going slowly into the human consumption on a bigger scale?
Well, that's the correct chain of events, right? So, I mean, the insect kingdom is the biggest kingdom by far of the, plants probably and mushrooms and so on are bigger, but of the animal kingdom, shall we say, insects are the largest. And so they're the most successful, prolific species or kingdom, like I said. And they're very high protein. They're extremely efficient digesters of food. And so they belong very much within our diet. They would be a very efficient way for us to consume protein and a raft of other good products within the bug. And if we have a mental hurdle with consuming them, then yes, they should be fed to animals first. So at least the animals we eat have not been fed off highly unsustainably farmed feed.
Other animals, right?
Yes. So, I mean, if you're going to eat a chicken, at least eat a chicken where 10, 15, 20, 25% of its diet was insect, rather than, you know, unnecessarily farmed soy, or no, that's more for cattle, but alfalfa or whatever, right? I mean, these are the vegetables, which are also sometimes high in protein and omega oils that are farmed, could be substituted, some of it, with insect, which uses very little water, virtually no land, and very often food waste from the third of the food waste that we started the interview with. So in terms of like creating circularity in the economy, that's a low-hanging fruit. Collect your food waste, feed it to an insect, feed the insect to a chicken or a fish, and eat that instead of, you know, creating some enormously elaborate supply chain for animal feed for a fish or a shrimp that you then end up eating. So, I mean, we are already eating insects. It should play a much bigger role in our diets. Nobody says that you have to be given, you know, a caramelized cricket, although they taste very nice. In the same way that nobody says you have to be given a caramelized chicken to eat. You know, you get it as chicken nuggets or whatever. It will be presented to you in a pretty way to eat, in a pretty wrapper, so that you can eat it. But of course, insects will, one way or another, make their way into our diet, and within not a long time, most of your listeners and yourself will be knowingly be eating insect, and you will find it all right.
Have you had some?
Oh, of course.
Yes?
I can't be doing this job and not, you know, taking a deep breath, and I've really challenged myself also to eat them unprettified, to kind of get past the mental block.
So like, you know, a grilled cockroach and you eat it straight away without...
not cockroach yet, but cricket.
Cricket,
yeah. Cricket, fly larvae, absolutely. Yeah.
Fly larvae is the black fly.
Yes. Yeah, black soldier fly larvae.
Okay.
I'll happily
and
have a mouthful
that's
of that.
edible. You would just eat it.
I mean, look, it's not exactly enjoyable, but it's not nasty. But we might as well just force ourselves over the mental barrier, because it's coming, and the planet needs you to eat the stuff, and it needs you to be substituting out some of the other food groups that you're consuming, which aren't, you know, we desperately need you to not eat, so that the farming of it can just reduce a little bit. And in the meantime, we need to find ways of farming the things we do want to eat in a more, again, sustainable way. Yeah. So here in the Gulf, for example, a lot of fruits and vegetables and leafy greens are being farmed in indoor vertical farms, and that's a perfectly logical transition as well. Okay. So between insect protein, indoor vertical farming, introducing low freshwater substitutes like algae, microalgae and macroalgae. Macroalgae is seaweed. These are perfectly acceptable food groups that belong in our diet.
Okay.
and can spur a whole slew of startups.
All right, let's take a quick break.
Okay.
So you studied marine oceanography.
Are we hot?
We're on.
Okay.
You studied marine oceanography.
Yes, I studied marine oceanography
So you've
at
had
South.
the passion for this topic for early on, or or was it like a fluke decision?
No, I think I've been drawn to the earth sciences from a very long time ago. And although I worked hard in my career to sort of get myself back onto a business track,
You went and did an MBA.
well, I joined the oil and gas industry, hoping to change from within.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Okay.
And I worked sort of offshore, and then I worked onshore, participating in the energy transition. And back then, the energy transition was not to renewable energy; it was from oil to gas. So I wanted to
Okay.
participate in that transition. Anyway, the purpose of this show is not why I left the oil and gas industry, but I'm happy to have that conversation with anybody else who wants to ask me.
But why did you leave the oil and gas industry? You worked with Shell for quite some
I
time,
worked for
right?
Shell International.
And
yeah.
you were trying to hopefully instill some change from within.
So I worked as an environmentalist within that company for a good long time, especially marine oriented, because that's where my education lies, and looking at coastal impacts and so on. And the impact is quite substantial. So I moved more onto the business side, at least to say, fine, let me change what I maybe can change and support the move from oil to gas. And I think the oil and gas industry has moved a lot to gas, but there's still a huge amount of oil being produced. And oil and gas companies make very bold promises around reduction targets, whether it's reduction targets in terms of dirty water that they're producing, because of course oil companies produce huge amounts of water from underground. But I don't really see them meeting those dirty water targets, what they call produced water targets. And they flare off, so they burn off a lot of natural gas when the gas is not of commercial quantity, they burn it off because the methane is less toxic to the environment than the carbon dioxide. Plus, it reduces the explosion risk if they burn it off in controlled circumstances. And when I was at Shell, we had a target to reduce flare burning to zero by like 2020. That target has come and gone, and there's no such zero around. And I don't think Shell is alone in that respect. I think every big oil major out there is setting themselves targets. Now it's all about transition to renewable energy. I no longer believe that they will achieve those targets because maybe they're not adequately incentivized to do so. And I have a lot of oil and gas friends who may be listening in on this show who'll be very upset by what I'm saying, but it is how I feel. So anyway, I eventually left that industry and joined the construction industry, looking to make some changes there as well. And I think the call to the earth sciences was too strong. I
think you're atoning yourself now.
Adorning myself, perhaps, yeah.
By investing in the nature economy and agri-tech.
I think my soul can't be redeemed. I can never
But you're eating insects. You're doing something.
Nothing that I can do in my lifetime will undo my carbon footprint, having worked 10 years in the oil, or 12 years in the oil industry and 11 years in the construction industry. But I'm hoping maybe I can kickstart a trend that then can continue and deliver much more impact than positive impact than the negative impact I have participated in. Anyway, so the call of the earth sciences was very strong for me, and I wanted to get back to marine science, and I wanted to get back to the earth sciences. And I felt that the planetary health debate was somewhere where I could intervene, combined with my experience in venture capital, or more specifically angel investing. I started to see how I could join some dots there. There was movement in agri-tech, in the planetary health debate, and in venture capital. And so I joined those dots and set up this fund.
So what are you seeing on the startup space? And even I hosted actually Philip Bahoshi on the previous episode.
I saw that.
And
Philip's an incredibly smart guy.
Yeah, and there's quite a bit of data, obviously, on how much money is going where. So there's just over $3 billion that was invested in MENA, and obviously the majority of that is going into three sectors: fintech, e-commerce, and transport and
Logistics,
logistics. So, I mean, how do you raise funding for climate? How challenging has it been for you?
Oh, it's very, very challenging. It's challenging on a number of fronts. People associate the startup world's intervention in climate change as being clean tech or climate tech, right? And when people say clean tech or climate tech, what they mean is energy decarbonization, transport decarbonization, so nuclear and fusion and solar power and new electric vehicles and electric mobility solutions and optimized mobility solutions. And these are extremely important industries that need to be reformed environmentally to achieve net zero, right? Net zero carbon by whatever the target you set, 2030, 40 or 50. And the world absolutely needs those efforts. And it is right that, climate or clean tech is not receiving a big share of funding at the moment, but that share is increasing, and I think it will play a bigger role in the next 2 or 3 years. But farming, forestry, and land use in general contribute as much greenhouse gases to the atmosphere as transport and energy combined. And this is it's a well-known fact to people in that industry, but it's kind of not acknowledged by your average consumer base, how big a carbon footprint farming, forestry, and land use, including sea use, by the way, has. And it is as ripe, if you'll pardon the pun, for transformation as energy and transport are, and deserve to become part of the climate tech debate. And to that end, we're not seeing a lot of VC capital acknowledging that role in climate, but we are seeing them acknowledging the importance of agri-tech to feed the world. And it just so happens that there's a healthy overlap between planetary health and agri-tech. And that's where we sit, in that overlap. And it's important, and you'll find that I keep saying planetary health.
Yes, I was going to ask
and that's very important because to talk about climate means atmosphere. Right? Climate comes with weather and so on, weather patterns, because we've been programmed to associate weather with climate change, with carbon emissions, right? And that's the chain. And that's like talking about human health in terms of body weight. And if we solve body weight, we've solved human health, which any one of us knows is completely not true. There's many other factors contributing to human health. And similarly, there's many factors contributing to planetary health, of which atmospheric carbon is one, and must be addressed, and is being addressed very effectively. But the things we talked about before, soil carbon, biodiversity, agri-food systems, these are equally important contributors to planetary health, and they belong under climate tech as well.
Okay. So what kind of companies are you currently investing in Africa that are tackling some of these challenges?
So we've spoken about food groups, right? We've spoken about insect protein and marine plants and vegetables. We think that's very, very interesting. We like farming technology, so precision farming, where you can get more produce for less resources. Even in mass farming, which we don't really believe is very sustainable, but at least if you must farm en masse, do so with the fewest resources possible, right? So that you don't go out and claim more land to achieve more growth. We delay that process a little bit of claiming more wilderness to farm. So if I can support a fish farm or a land-based terrestrial farm to produce as much yield or more yield with less water, less fertilizer, less pesticide, more accurate pH monitoring, that's a win for us from a planetary point of view. Okay. We like robotics quite a lot. We think, again, it's all about capturing crop at its optimal point so that we reduce the wastage. On the topic of wastage, the entire suite of opportunities that can reduce food wastage, whether it's in the supply chain or whether it's off the plate, or wastage from supermarkets, because there's huge wastage from supermarkets and restaurants as well, and there are very interesting products coming up, including here in the region, to reduce that food wastage. This is all part of that continuum of opportunities that we look at. And then there's a sort of slightly parallel track, which is to do with the brain drain that's occurring from the agricultural community. So, I mean, there's a mass migration happening of farmers who just can't sustain their livelihoods, and they're moving to urban centers to get jobs as security guards or whatever. or even leaving the country altogether just to find a better life because you can't make a good life as a farmer. And we want to keep the best talent on the farm, because if those farms are ever to transform into a more digitalized operation, you need the most digitized farmers performing that. And so any fintech tool that supports farmers improving their livelihood, getting access to capital so they can invest in their farms and create better, produce better yields, improve their profitability. Any technology that allows us to keep the best talent on the farm so that we can talk to them about regenerative farming, so we can help push them in that direction, that's on mission for us. So agri-insurance, digital marketplaces, e-wallets for farmers so they can access the subsidies as applicable, or their payments from their suppliers, get better insight into where real-time pricing is so they can sell into the best markets and cut out, what are often very sharkish middlemen. And so that even though it's a small farm, it still has enormous power in terms of its access in the market.
So why has it? I mean, you've listed so many opportunities, and I could see so many opportunities across the board. Why hasn't this taken off yet? Is it? I mean, because investors obviously they're looking for return on investment, or you're gonna have to look into more of like developmental funds, right? I had the IFC. For example, someone from the IFC on the show as well. They spoke about, bringing in billions of dollars to sponsor big projects like that. But are these investments not lucrative from a return standpoint, or is there another reason why this hasn't taken off?
So we as a fund look a little bit around where has agri-tech taken off, when and why. And what we've spotted is, and again, this is not some moment of genius of ours, we were helped along in the discovery phase, is that especially in South America and South Asia, an agri-tech boom followed a fintech boom, right? So fintech...
Why is that?
Because
fintech banks the unbanked, or?
Exactly.
Okay.
Farmers that previously were unbanked or unbankable suddenly had access to profits, and now they had access to capital, including venture debt, so that they could start investing in their farms and producing more and producing better, and producing higher quality, which meant higher profitability, even if it didn't always produce higher yields in absolute terms. And so we think that the reason agri-tech has not fully taken off in Africa and the Middle East yet, and the statistic there is that our region attracts 1% of global agri-tech funding, is that we hadn't had a fintech boom until recently.
Okay.
And you could argue whether we are pre-peak or at peak or post-peak, but we can squarely say that we're in the middle of our fintech boom right now. We're nicely in the window, right? Which means that this region is ripe for a real wave in agri-tech as well, and for especially smallholder farmers who are huge in number, right? I mean, Africa, 60% of Africa's population is somehow employed in farming, but they're very kind of micro farmers. Most of them are subsistence farmers. And these tech tools can aggregate them and give them leverage and power, which means that they have, they can become wealthier. There's a really huge opportunity there. It is not right that Africa, which is 3 times the size of, the Oceania region, so Australia, New Zealand, and the Arctic Circle, and 30 times the population, receives as much ag-tech funding as those regions. So the premise that this space is not lucrative is just plain wrong. And we present ourselves as an impact fund, but make it very clear that that does not mean that we are in any way sacrificing on venture returns.
Yeah. That's not a charity.
Or, not at all.
Yeah.
We are absolutely expecting venture returns for our investors, but we just think it's a missed opportunity to not focus on those startups that also deliver substantial planetary impact.
But maybe the way you might evaluate a startup would be different, right, than the other sectors. So,
Correct.
for example, like in e-commerce, you're going to look at their month-on-month growth. There's certain unit economics there that make sense and that show promise in that specific startup. Whereas, I guess for agriculture, it's different, right? So how do you? What is you invest in early stage in these startups, which means like you're probably the first money in, or the second money in.
We would like to be first institutional capital into these startups,
Okay.
and we subject those startups to all the commercial rigor in the screening process that any other startup would receive, right?
Okay. So are there specific KPIs in that industry that, you know, a startup needs to reach so that they can go and raise additional funding? Like, how do you evaluate startups in these sectors?
It's such a broad suite of startups that we look at, and
Okay.
each one has its own set of
So
metrics that
robotics would be
matter.
different than a marketplace would be.
Absolutely, but it's
Okay.
all the same. I mean, of course, being very early stage investors, we accept lower traction, we accept lower revenues, but the path to profitability has to be as persuasive as any other startup that
Okay.
we would evaluate if we weren't an agri-impact fund, but we are. But in addition to all the sort of usual product tests and market fit tests and competitive tests that our portfolio must stand up to,
Yeah.
we're also looking for, is there a direct line of sight to planetary impact as well? So we talk about talent staying on farms, that has to be clear line of sight to that. Reduction in carbon footprint, increase in nature footprint, maybe substantial savings in resources like water or fertilizer. Okay. There has to be direct line of sight to that sort of impact, in addition to all the same commercial tests that we would subject a startup to.
So in terms of returns on the fund, do you look at the same period as a typical venture capital fund would
Absolutely.
look into? So around 10 years?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because there's no, I mean, we're seeing pipeline, right? We're looking at deals, and there's no reason that we see to have to sacrifice any of those things. Now, of course, there are some opportunities that would be enormously impactful, which don't respect the 10-year timeline, which don't respect the venture type returns. These are important projects that need to be backed. They deserve oxygen to grow and deliver their impact. They're just not venture grade, and therefore we will not address them.
So they will go to an IMF or maybe
for
government
example, or IFC, but yes.
Sorry, IFC,
Yeah,
sorry, not IMF.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. Okay. So on that, there is obviously there was COP27 in Egypt last year. There's a lot of hype around it. There's COP28 is going to happen here in the UAE this year. Are these events helpful to put this discussion on the table?
I have the experience of one COP, right? So I'm not
so
sure.
You attended the one in Egypt?
I attended COP27, but of course it was in my home country.
Yes.
And so I'm really going to sort of answer this from a pretty amateur perspective, right? But I will say that I discovered two COPs at that event. There was the negotiations, which were fascinating, right? So here we're talking, 150 or so countries, each with their representatives, negotiating multiple files simultaneously while trying to sort of integrate with one another to make sure that promises being made in one room align with promises being made in another room, and really quite experienced negotiators, and from what I saw, very committed servants of their countries, of their national agendas, but also of the climate agenda, working very, very hard to try to navigate each other's economic, but also climate objectives.
Okay. So it's like a workshop, basically. It's not just talks and panels and...
It's not like any workshop you've ever seen before.
Okay.
I mean, really, you're talking about, 12, 15, 20 rooms, each one packed with people, each person representing their country and having their staff with them, behind them, continuously talking back and forth and then negotiating with their partners and then going out and seeing what other rooms are promising and aligning. And it's hard to understand how in the span of 2, 3, 4 weeks, any progress can be made under that sort of environment, but that's their challenge, and they're very experienced negotiators. And then we can argue around the sincerity of some of their objectives or the insincerity, but the people that I met from small countries, tiny islands that sometimes you've never heard of, and huge countries, they were taking it very, very seriously, right? And they were really trying to advance an agenda and make progress in the face of enormous challenges. All of that was one COP. And the other COP was outside with the pavilions and countries, singing their own praises and signing MOUs for enormous projects and congratulating themselves on how sustainable and green they are, and lots of applause and agreements being signed, and look how amazing we are, which was sort of like a real life Instagram feed of self-congratulation, some of which was genuinely impactful and impressive, and much of it was insincere nonsense.
Okay.
Right?
But does it help? Sorry.
No, that's it.
Does it help more funds like yours, for example, these types of initiatives? Does it help you when you go fundraising?
Well, I don't know if it helped us to fundraise being there, but what
Helps raise awareness, maybe?
a lot of these things are timing, right? Are you talking about something that the world is talking about, or are you just too far behind the curve or too far ahead of your time? And it was helpful for us to understand what are the emerging themes and do they align with what we want to talk about, in which case our moment is right. And that was helpful. It was helpful to understand what is being discussed and what is likely to be discussed at the next COP and the one after.
Okay. So you will be attending COP28?
Don't know yet.
Don't know yet?
Yeah.
Okay. Why not? Is it like, you don't believe in the value of it, or is it some other personal reasons?
The jury is out for me on whether I believe in the value of it.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. But that being said, I believe that, the Emirates, the host nation of the next COP, will really rise to the challenge. I know that there's some controversy around the championship of the COP and the role of the fossil fuel industry, of course, in the Emirates being a huge fossil fuel producer. But I'm optimistic that the quality of the discourse at this COP, hopefully will be a very high quality of discourse.
Hossam, you drew my attention to a guy called Neil Spackman and his work on regenerative farming. I saw he had a documentary that he shot in an area called Al Baida in Saudi Arabia, where they really transformed an arid piece of land into a relatively green area, an ecosystem, which is really fascinating. He said something very interesting in that documentary, and I'm going to quote him here. He said, people can be good for the earth. We are not destructive by nature, but by habit. And our potential for destruction is mirrored by our potential for regeneration. Are people inherently, bad or doing a lot of damage, or all of this could be fixed, for the lack of a better word?
So I've not been in this field for long enough, and I've not been a practitioner in this field for long enough to be able to comment with any kind of expertise. There are some seriously brilliant minds out there, including Neil Spackman, who I have enormous respect for. But when I hear that the climate crisis is actually a crisis of apathy, that rings a bell for me. That our lives very often, especially in the global north, have become so comfortable that we cease to kind of worry about other problems. Mm-hmm. And so we consume mindlessly and needlessly and sort of don't worry about the consequences. And I think that's kind of what Neil maybe is talking about, that it's our lack of awareness that just allows us to consume. And if we were aware, and if we could see and feel the destruction, we would be less relaxed or glib about it. But it wasn't always like that, right? Humanity is many thousands of years old, and we have behaved in the past in ways that very much respected the earth and worked with the earth rather than against it. And understood that the earth gives us, and we eat and consume from it. And in some respects, and I don't want to get religious about this, this show or this discussion, but in some ways, it is here to feed us and to serve us. And we've lost that. And in some respects, we are now paying to destroy nature, because by paying subsidies, for example, to farmers to use pesticides and synthetic fertilizers that destroy the earth, then we're placing a negative value on earth. And we need to accept that nature has been subsidizing the global economy for about 250 years, and that it's teetering on bankruptcy. And what do you do when you can no longer afford a subsidy? You either have to phase it out, or you have to start paying for what you're getting. And I mean, Neil is a wonderful champion of let's stop using this subsidy and start working with nature and let it help us and we help it. Like I said earlier, nature has 500 million years of track record. We just have to make space for it to do its thing that serves us. Gives us water for free, gives us air for free, gives us temperate climates very often in some in many geographies for free, gives us soil quality for free. We just have to let it do its thing and not continuously work against it and prevent it from doing its job. That's all we have to do. But we have gotten very comfortable and very wealthy by pursuing that very negative strategy, and we have to be weaned off it because that subsidy is about to run out.
What can you leave our listeners with in terms of just a bit of advice maybe, or things that we can do on a daily basis so that we're more aware and mindful of what's going on?
Oh man, I mean, look, I'm a fund manager, right? So I don't really have answers to that question, but sort of lead a more sustainable life at the personal level, you mean?
Yes. I mean, because as an average person, you hear about all these climate discussions and all of that, and then we alluded to that a little bit in our discussion, right? Like you don't know what you need to do on the personal level.
Yes, okay, fair enough. Look, I don't know if let me give you 3 or 4 sort of ones, but I don't know where they rank in order of importance of the 100 things that you could do. But I think reduce your animal intake to maybe 3-4 meals a week. That may sound hard, right? But we're talking cold cuts and meat and chicken, fish and eggs, and just reduce animal intake to a couple of meals a week and challenge yourself to eat something else, right? That's one. Cluster your transport. So, I mean, for example, I'm now in Dubai, but I combine that with a trip to Saudi, Riyadh, and Jeddah, and so on, and then I won't come back out here for a while. So cluster transport as much as possible. And this is really going to be controversial, but I would say if you're at a stage where you're planning family, maybe plan one less child than you were otherwise planning, because I think one of our biggest carbon footprints and nature footprints today is the number of new humans we bring into the world. So that's one.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that,
Thank
Hossam.
you so much
I
for
really
having
enjoyed
me
our
on the
conversation.
show.
See you soon.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Conversations with Loulou with Hossam Allam. I hope you enjoyed it. To learn more about Climate Resilience Fund, visit climateresilience.fund. Don't forget to check out conversationswithloulou.com to listen to all the other episodes. You can also reach out to me on all social media platforms at Loulou Khazan. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube to get the latest episodes, and do leave us a rating and a review. It really helps us in getting the show discovered. Wishing you love, light, and see you in a few weeks.